Good evening, folks. Mark Friesen here, representing the PPC out of Saskatoon Grasswood. Myself and Salim Mansour had a discussion last week after an interview that we had done together, and the idea was to bring in a roundtable of folks within the PPC, candidates throughout Canada that have certain and specific knowledge of some issues. Of course, Salim being an expert on globalism and Islamism, we've had those two topics identified as two that we'll talk about tonight, and immigration. So what we did is we brought together some people. Unfortunately, Salim couldn't make it tonight. He has another situation that he has to deal with. So we brought together some other folks in his place. So I'm going to introduce those folks as we go around. Of course, I'm Mark Friesen, and this is Frank Vaughan, Professor David Hassel, Laura Tyler Thompson, and Ivan Pack. So thanks everybody for coming to the table and having this discussion. I think it's an important discussion. I think we have a lot to offer. I think the People's Party is the only party that stands against these issues directly and clearly. And I think it's important that we can show whoever's going to watch the video and live on Facebook that we aren't afraid to have this discussion.
Yeah.
And we recognize as a party that it's important to have these discussions. So if you'd like to each tell the folks something about yourself really quickly, we can go from there. So Frank?
Yeah, I'm a political commentator that you might be familiar with. I'm also a garlic farmer, community-involved guy, and a big fan of the PPC.
And my day job is a professor, a social scientist, and I like to read a lot of studies and get the facts.
And I'm Laura Tyler Thompson, here to defend Canada and stand for all that is right and good without being politically correct.
And my name is Ivan Pack from Richmond, BC, and I'm an immigrant myself, so that's why I'm here tonight, talk about immigrations from an immigrant's perspective.
Very good. Thank you. So, as Ivan mentioned, immigration is a important policy platform of the PPC. In fact, it's one of our top issues, I think, as a party, and really separates us from the rest of the establishment. Because again, we're not afraid to have the discussion. We're not afraid to actually reduce the immigration numbers to a manageable number. And I think numbers are important when we're having this discussion of immigration. Thoughts?
Oh, go ahead, Frank.
It's about protecting Canada for everybody that's here right now. If you want to have a Canada that is representative of what people like yourself came here to experience, you have to devise an immigration policy that's going to protect that, not an immigration policy that's based on virtue signaling. And I think that's what we're trying to do, and it's a policy that's consistent with what the majority of Canadians want.
Yeah, and I always tell constituents that, in fact, we are the most pro-immigrant party you can be, because if you really care about the people who are coming to your country, you want to make sure that they can become integrated into your country successfully so that they are welcomed. And the best social scientific evidence, a guy who is producing some really great research right now is a guy named Eric Kaufman, and he's out of the University of London. And he's shown that the best thing you can do when you're dealing with immigration is to make sure that the number is low enough that the people coming in can integrate, and also so that the people who are already in the country welcome them. When numbers get too high, that's when tensions begin to rise. And you see things like enclaves, where people don't integrate, and instead they become more insular.
Ghettoization.
And this is a real problem, because I want to show as much compassion as we can to the people who come to our country.
Yes.
And the way that you do that is to be able to have a manageable number that allows us to show that compassion.
Ivan and I really, we had to come to terms with this whole issue, because when I was running in Burnaby South, here I was surrounded by immigrants, and I was being called a racist. And when I went up against Jagmeet Singh in the debates, Jagmeet himself calling me a racist because we wanted to stand for safe borders. And here we were dealing with something really particular in Burnaby South, and that was the death of Marissa Shen, a girl who Trudeau certainly does not want to talk about, a girl that the left-wing media is not talking about, a 13-year-old girl who was murdered in Central Park, right in our riding, very close to where many of the constituents lived. And Ivan, here they were calling me a racist while they would show pictures of me completely surrounded by immigrants, right, from all different nationalities. And this is something that we can't cave into because somebody calls us bad names. We can't cave into because somebody is trying to define what makes you, a good person, or you're evil because you want a safe Canada. No, this is a real family. It was an immigrant family. Marissa's family were immigrants, and their daughter will never be back. And so the fellow that is facing the murder charges is a refugee, Syrian refugee. And so this is a real issue. Nobody is trying to be racist, but it's an important issue for the safety of our nation.
And if I remember reading about that, you were simply saying we need to look at vetting people who are coming into our country.
Yes.
Like that's what you were talking about. You weren't talking about skin color. You weren't talking about ethnicity. You were saying we need to vet people because there are certain values.
Yes.
And you wanted to talk about that. And Jagmeet didn't want to talk at all.
No.
Right? It was all about censorship.
Yeah.
But Ivan, what's it like for you? You're going to be campaigning in Burnaby.
I'm campaigning in Richmond, and
Richmond.
It's a riding with a lot of immigrants from Asia, from Hong Kong, where I came from, and the reason why I support PPC on this immigration policy is I, as an immigrant myself, I want to be treated equally and fairly. Okay, and I do not want people to jumping over the line for the first. I immigrate here legally with my parents 23 years ago. And now we have this government is opening our border to likely everybody, right? So everybody can cross the border from the state and then claim they want to stay here, right? And so, from my perspective, it's not fair to us. And we also are these people trying to integrate into the society. And I know a lot of people having really hard time, integrating into, for example, learning the language to speak in English or French and our official language. And I tell myself every single day to practice my English, speak more, and then talk to people, speak English. And that's the way I want. I'm trying to integrate to. And I think some people has been discouraging. Because our government is telling people, well, it's okay to be a Chinese. It's okay to speak Chinese in your own community. And I think that's wrong. Because the reason why I'm here is because I believe in Canadian values. Okay, and very less likely in the Chinese community, people don't talk about Canadian values. Okay, to me, democracy is one of the Canadian values. Freedom of speech is one of the, and the freedom of speech is something actually made me make that such a decision to come over here, to leave my home country, behind.
And now you're seeing it disappear.
And I'm seeing right here in Canada. So freedom of speech is being taken away, slowly, bit by bit.
Well, when we have a prime minister that refers to our country as a post-nation state, and refers to our country as not having an identity.
Right.
That's very concerning to me and to most people, I think, in the party, but most Canadians. At the end of the day, when we say and we talk about our culture, we talk about our values, we're talking about freedom, liberty, justice, equality, tolerance, compassion, responsibility, in totality, right? Because there's a lot of countries that may share some of those values, or maybe at a limited sense all of those values, but there's only really one country in the world, I believe, that shares all of those values in totality, and that's Canada.
Yes.
So we want to keep those values, and we want to protect those values and those ideals in order for us to remain a country where people can and do want to come.
And the irony there is that when you look at how the media portrays this issue, right? So we very specifically, when Max delivered this policy, he said, here are the values that we want you to integrate to. We want you to treat men and women equally. We want you to support democracy. We want you to support free expression. We want you to say, the lifestyle you choose, you get the right to choose that. And we can have the opportunity to really have disagreements with tolerance, right? So he's asking for that. He's asking for that. So I would ask the media, which one of these values don't you want newcomers to hold?
Right.
I mean, that should be our question. All the values that we're saying should be held are things that are protected by our charter. So how can the media not support this? It used to be the case that if a politician said, "I don't want you to hold these values," that's the scandal.
Right, that's the radical.
Now we have a
script is
politician.
flipped.
Exactly. So that to me is really, really curious that we've gotten to this point where supporting these values is controversial.
Right, and here we have Professor Salim Mansour, who our party has embraced, who is being called the racist out in the public. Like, sorry, but nobody's believing you because there's no truth to it. I'm sitting here with Ivan. When we look at the diversity that is in our group, Professor Salim Mansour being welcomed into our party after being rejected by the Conservative Party of Canada. Why? Because Hamish Marshall said, well, this is too controversial, you know.
Islamophobic.
Right? We don't want to be called racist.
Right.
No, we'll leave that to the PPC. So we'll take the good candidates then, is how it's going to be. And we've reached a new season in time where the main political parties are refusing to have common sense. And that's why Maxime is saying that this is a new common sense revolution.
Well, and the new racism, as I like to call it, is actually labeling the PPC. All you have to do is come to one of our rallies and one of our events and just have a look at the crowd. Everybody's represented there. There's immigrants there. There's every kind of person there that you would think. And ignoring them, or what I see on Twitter all the time, is those people, like yourself sitting on this panel, somebody out there will say, "You're token." That's really racist. They're dismissing you. And they're dismissing everybody in the party like you that might be a visible minority or somebody who's immigrated here. That to me and I've been pointing that out, that's the actual exclusion.
Yeah.
And the idea that you brought up about integration into the country that you're coming to used to be a staple of immigration to any country. Somewhere along the way, the script is flipped. And now integration is a bad idea and balkanization is a good idea, and balkanization leads to the destruction of national integrity. So what is the value of somebody coming here if the nation itself is destroyed? And our nation is better, and that's the PPC says that.
So
Canada is superior in many ways.
I think it's interesting in the discussion now, because this can actually take us to the next topic, which would be globalism. So we have to ask the question, why is the establishment doing this? Why are they coming up with policies that go against what we're trying to do and protecting our culture and protecting our values and what we are and what it means to be Canadian?
It's really
So
terrifying.
why are they doing it?
Is it money? Is it is there a certain faction that is being bought off? Because it doesn't make sense if you really look at it. It doesn't make sense that candidates are being run in other parties that have links to really questionable ties to terrorism. Why is this an okay thing? Yet when our party, who is vetting very carefully at this point, because we know we'll be called out every single second. I mean, you know, it's a good thing that haven't had a speeding ticket in the last, well, it's been a week, right? So I'm fine now. But if we so much as step out over a line, we get called out. Why is the establishment? Why are we not being and thinking that it's more logical to protect our beautiful Canada with the values? Why are some leaders of other political parties, who shall remain unnamed, speaking to men who teach other men how to beat their wives, without leaving, marks or bruises, and it shouldn't be a too bad experience for her.
Right.
Why are they speaking to these people? These are not our Western values,
Well, they claim with that particular case where Andrew Scheer and also Justin Trudeau are meeting with the same individual, Omar Subudar,
Yeah.
I think is his first name. One of the counterpoints that's been brought to my attention is that he didn't know. But they have staffers that are paid to vet people and resources that our party doesn't have, and we catch these things. They won't let Salim in. They practice nepotism by getting rid of Mark King. They study everything. And you want me to believe that Scheer walked into a meeting with this person and sat down with him and had lunch, and somebody didn't know exactly who he was sitting down with.
With all the people they already have in the party that are very aware.
Yep.
And so the excuse is that it was ignorance. He just didn't know.
So I want to take a look at the 10,000 foot view and say, answer the question. So how do we get to this spot where people are embarrassed to stand up for Canadian values? And you can really trace it back to the movement within the universities, where people began to promote this idea of cultural relativism, where you couldn't say some cultures are better, right? It was and it was guilt driven, and certainly even so it was justified, because there was some really terrible behavior that was put forth by Western society.
You can take anything too far.
Yeah, exactly. But we threw the baby out with the bathwater, because you need to be able to say, this is very good about Canada. And you need to say that this culture is better than a culture where they stone women. This culture is better than a culture where they throw gay people off the roof. This is better. And so in the PPC, we are willing to say, no, it's better, and we're willing to protect it.
Right.
We're willing to have the tough conversation to say, there's a line. And this line is where Canadian values start, and when you don't have those Canadian values, you've crossed that line.
And when we protect it and when we cherish those values, people from countries that do have that oppression and do have that violence towards different genders, different sex, different, you name it, they want somewhere to go,
Right.
where they can contribute and where they'll be safe and where they'll be respected. And that's what we want to do. So how is that a bad thing? How can that be framed? All of a sudden we're the racists? I don't think so. I think we're the opposite of racist or bigoted.
Even in the policy that Max introduced, he makes specific reference to persecuted minorities that are in these countries. And he says, we want to actually give them priority.
Yep.
Right.
We know that you are being harmed, so therefore you will move to the front of the line. And that's what compassion is.
Yeah, and that was an electric moment, even watching it live. I was in my living room. Were some of you there? You
Yeah.
were?
I was there.
Yeah, I mean, and it was a standing ovation.
Right.
Because people are so excited that somebody is just saying what everyone is thinking, that we love Canada and we think it's worth protecting, and we love the people that embrace and also love our Canada. That is not a bad thing. That is a very good thing.
It's positive.
People
We're
are
the only
embracing
positive
it.
And it's
message.
healthy.
Yes.
So as it relates to globalism, now I asked earlier, why do we think they're doing this? And
You tell us,
I
Marcus,
think
we don't know.
I think what it is. Well, I think you do too. But I really think it's not that I think. I know it, and I confirm it through people like Salim. That the UN, of course, they are wanting to determine policy
Right.
for nations around the world. They're talking about an unelected foreign body that's developing policy, whether it's immigration, whether it's around refugees, whether it's around environment. They're developing policies at a global level, expecting countries like Canada throughout the West to follow those policies and impose those policies. And so when that's happening, we are losing our sovereignty. They're not stealing it, we're giving it to
Giving it
them.
away.
Right.
We're giving
Offering
our
it.
sovereignty away. And we've been doing it for a number of years. And so when we do that, when we relinquish that control and that sovereignty, we're at the mercy of a global migration compact that's now going to determine numbers of refugees and migrants that we're going to take in. I say refugees because there's actually two pacts. There's the Global Compact on Migration that everybody's aware of because the media spoke about it. The one they didn't speak about, the one that was signed a week later, is the Global Compact on Refugees. And nobody's talking about that because it's been overshadowed by Global Compact on Migration. And so now the Conservatives, when they come out and they denounce the GCM, where's the word on the Compact on Refugees? We hear nothing because there's no discussion, right? There's no talk about it in the media. It's not a hot button. There's nothing to gain for them to discuss it, but it's there and it exists. So we're at a position and we're at a place in time where we have a foreign entity that is establishing policy. Now, they're not imposing that policy because the UN ultimately doesn't have any power. But it's a slippery slope when you have establishment parties in Canada and throughout the West that are signing on to these agreements.
And it's not just, I mean, we have a precedent with the report on Indigenous people, which was another UN directive, which is now, I don't know if the policy has led to legislation. I don't know if that legislation is passed, but that UN directive became the foundation for a private member's bill that may have gone, I can't remember if it's gone through final reading, but to say that this incrementalism doesn't lead toward legislation in our country, it's just simply not true.
But it's a political sales pitch. So you
Non-binding.
go to the United Nations, you use this term non-binding. So, and they can paint any concern over the agreement as being you're being hyperbolic. You're worried about something that's not going to be implemented. But you don't need a law that comes from an international body when the people that are negotiating it go back to their home countries and pass it through their national parliaments and their legislatures. So that's how they're doing it. And if you're in the club, actually it's Orwellian. It's like oligarchical collectivism. We always talk about dictatorships, but it's an overused word. This is an oligarchy of unelected technocrats who move through national governments. They get together, they have these confabs, they decide on policy, they call it non-binding, they sell it to the public, they come home, they pass legislation, and before you know it, you lose your national sovereignty. And then when you combine that with cultural relativism, they're saying that all nations and all cultures are created equally. That's creating this homogeny that they can then sit on top of and direct.
Which is exactly,
I don't want that.
Which is exactly the overall agenda of making all countries on the planet equal. Right. So what happens? How does that look? What does that look like when we apply that ideology? Well, it looks like the West is here. We have a great standard of living. We have a great culture. We have a great way of life that everybody wants to come to. But we're going to bring that down to here throughout the West so we can bring the rest of the world here to this point. So then the whole world is down here, right? And then that's where globalism is taking control of our way of life. And we have to put a stop to that. We have to take it back. It's interesting because in 2004, Stephen Harper wrote a letter to the Canadian Alliance members. The letter stated, and I'll paraphrase, that the UN Sustainable Development Agenda is a socialist redistribution of wealth scheme meant to suck as much wealth out of the West as possible. Those were his words in a letter to the Canadian Alliance members. Interesting, because once he realized and understood that the Alliance wasn't going to get power, they flipped. And they went and they joined and they merged with the Red Tories, the PCs of old, who were part of the development of the Sustainable Development Agenda from 1992, when Mulroney signed it the first time. So here we go, fast forward, all of a sudden, 2015, the last time the Sustainable Development Agenda was signed by Stephen Harper 1 month before the election, which left the door wide open for then Trudeau to carry on promoting these same policies developed by a foreign entity that doesn't have the best interests of our country at heart. Right?
And then you've got leaders who are compromised because they're looking at their next promotion, right?
Absolutely.
So once they're done with being the prime minister, then they want to have a seat at at the UN, and then it's compromised. Everything's compromised.
And if you're in the club, it's a great deal,
Right.
And you have no principles.
Yeah.
You can just live with it.
To your point, Mark, and you mentioned, bring everybody down. There's another way to look at it, and this is the way that I would look at it, is I really want to see, I'm concerned about people in developing nations, right?
We all are.
Right?
And we should be.
And so, but I also know that the way that you bring them up is not through handouts.
Right.
It's not through everybody just comes into your country. What you do is you invest. And we've seen this in India, we saw this in China, and in the last 10 years, we have seen poverty eliminated in places like India and China in the millions. And it hasn't been socialism that did that.
Exactly.
It is industry and investment and development. And the single greatest way to bring people out of poverty is to give them the resources in their country through investment and through capital.
Right. And what better, sorry Frank, and what better country to champion that than Canada, who's a leader in the world in all of these issues, and up to and including responsibility. we can decide who we want to help, how much we want to help them with, and what's it going to. We can have control, as opposed to having all of our wealth and a lot of our resources handed to this entity that doesn't have our interest, that casts our interest aside, actually, in favor of the agenda that they've decided is priority. So, go ahead, Frank. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say a good video that illustrates this, and you could argue with different points in the video, is Immigration Gumballs. Type it into YouTube, and it talks about how you can't immigrate your way out of global poverty.
No.
Especially if you buy the line that our governments feed us, that we need to bring in people, and it is the myth that it's all economic migrants that are younger, and we've proven, the PPC's proven that that's false. If you do that, and you believe what they're saying, you're taking their best and their brightest, and you're further impoverishing. At the same time as you're destabilizing your own country. So it's like you said, you have to invest, and you have to build business, and you have to build exchange. You can't do it through welfare.
And added to all of it, just the general corruption, like you were talking about. If you don't have integrity, you can get a great seat at any table. So now you just have a global problem of corruption in all of these countries that are even attempting to be helped through
Right.
good people or good meaning
Right.
people. So it's a very huge issue.
Ivan, your family immigrated from Hong Kong, right?
Yep.
So have you gone back to Hong Kong at any point?
Yes, I have.
So the difference between Hong Kong and China, in Hong Kong had full capitalization, right?
Yep.
What's the difference? Like when you look at the difference, and China is improving, but from a first person perspective, like what do you see between Hong Kong and China?
My family actually moved from China to Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when I was 14, and when my parents actually make a good living, because they studied hard, they were medical doctors, but they weren't licensed, and they have to go through all the exams and then study and then get the license and become a medical doctor again in Hong Kong. But the system in Hong Kong is very simple. It's not just the tax system. It's how you how you find a job, how you do business, or start your own business, stuff like that. And it's the beauty of capitalism. And because you try harder, you get you earn more incomes, and then you live better. And but the difference between China and Hong Kong is the government in China is controlling everything. My mom used to tell me when she graduated from the university, she had a job already, right? Because the government is assigning a job to you. You have no choice. Right?
Right.
So, and by taking away people's choice, and some people think, oh, that's efficient, right? Because and then every decision has been made, yeah. But it actually discouraging people to actually to work better for themselves,
Sure.
right? And you get paid no matter what. The janitor is getting the same amount of the salary as the medical doctors, but the medical doctors spend like 8 years in university to study hard, right? And so. Then people lost their interest to work harder.
Right. What's
Right.
the incentive?
So yeah, and then so when we move to Hong Kong, we see a different world. In Hong Kong, we can actually have a dream, to have a better life of the family, and so this is something I always cherish, being capitalism, and then also, I don't want any government control.
Right.
Okay, yes, some in some degrees, government should do something about, for example, to take care of the poor, build up a social net, a net to actually help people to move up, and but in the big pictures, and the government should leave them, their hands off anything,
Well, there's a limit. Like
Yep.
you can go too far even with the things that you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Like once you pass a certain point, there's diminishing returns. It's
Yeah.
actually a negative return.
Yeah.
But there we have a perfect example. So China, which is now beginning to use a capitalist system, at least as it's modified by them, and they're lifting people out of poverty. Hong Kong was already lifted out of poverty, and then your parents eventually make the choice, and now we're going to go to Canada. And then I imagine they enjoyed even more freedom.
Oh, definitely. And for China, okay, you mentioned about they are adopting capitalism, but only on an economy level. Politically, there's no freedom of speech. There's only one party ruling, and so now we see the problem with Hong Kong, because I have to mention it because there's a protest now in Hong Kong, and they're trying to fight for freedom of speech, they want to elect their own governors and all those legislators and they should be elected. Okay, and we have all the members in the House of Commons being elected. That's the democracy system, right? And but the Chinese government promised Hong Kong, Hong Kong people will have it, but they're just stalking it, they're pushing it, and then say, "Oh, I didn't mean it," and then you have your vote, but I'm going to choose the candidate.
Right.
So that's not democracy,
No.
right? It's not, and so people are protesting it because they think the government of China will listen. Yeah, but to the very extent, I don't believe the Chinese government will listen, because they are always one party ruling. They will never give away their control. So they won't.
They can't. They won't survive if they do.
Yes, if they give away everything they have. Yeah.
So, I mean, the takeaway, and I think a lot of Canadians share this takeaway, is capitalism good, socialism bad, ultimately, and I believe that, and I think a lot of
With the caveat that we've got to get rid of crony capitalism.
Yes, we
Yes.
do.
Right?
Yeah,
Which is
absolutely. We're talking about-
And corporate
a major
welfare.
plank of the
Yeah.
PPC is let's get rid
Yeah.
of crony capitalism.
Right.
Yeah, there's a big difference between that and like what we have now and what pure capitalism is supposed to look like.
Right. So as this issue, we sort of went there and then now we went away, but we're going to bring it back. Globalism and Islamism and how that fits into this web, because it is a web. And so I've, in my long years of research and studying this and speaking with Celine, which has been such a great boost to us, and I think for the party and for Canada to have somebody with that credibility coming to the table to be able to discuss this issue. So globalism and Islamism, how is that related? It's Tom Quiggin makes the reference, the Red-Green Alliance. So it's interesting, and I don't want to go too deep into the weeds because we could probably be here for 4 hours talking about it, but we think it's important to touch on it. So when we're looking at the UN and understanding who is the UN and who's making the policies and creating these policies, like the Sustainable Development Agenda, and who's pushing the policies within that agenda, we have to understand who makes up the UN. So it's a bunch of countries, it's 195 countries on the planet, but within that 195 there are voting blocks. And within those voting blocks, there are subgroups. Now, the largest voting bloc at the UN presently is a group called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which make up 56 plus 1. So 56 Islamic countries plus Palestine, because it's not necessarily a country or it's up for debate. So we have 56 plus 1, the largest voting bloc, part of another bloc that isn't necessarily a voting bloc, but it's a large group of countries, none of which are Western nations, called NAM. Now, NAM was set up, of course, earlier during the Cold War, and all the countries in that group were sort of non-committal to either side. That issue was resolved in 1990, but that group called NAM still remains. And like I said, not one of them are a Western nation. So now the OIC is part of that group. All Islamic countries are part of NAM. So we have a voting bloc of countries of 125 out of 195. 56 plus 1 of those carry huge influence in creating policy at the UN level. So who is creating the policies that our governments throughout the West, Canada included, why are we in that position? Why have we put ourselves into that position? And why are we agreeing to policies created by countries that have no interest in Canada's best interest? So when we talk about Islamists, so the Muslim Brotherhood has the control when we're talking about the OIC. They are the power bloc. Now, of course, each of those countries have their own power resources. But there is this power group of the Muslim Brotherhood who is directing traffic, for lack of a better word. And they're using our system, our freedoms, our charter, our way of life, but they're using it in a way against us, to defeat us, to bring that ideation, I guess, or ideology to Canada, to influence how we do business right here in our own country. Not to mention at the UN, they already have that influence, but now they're going to do it from this end too, from the front end. Want to expand?
Well, I think one thing that comes to mind right away is in what you're describing. You're talking about an organization of cooperative nations that are much and an ideology that are much better coordinated and have a better and more assertive sense of identity than we do at this current time. And that's there's actually something there to observe, because if you're going to try and combat an enemy, if you will, you have to see their strengths. And one of our weaknesses is that we've sacrificed our core identity.
Right.
And Islamism, which just to make the case, we have to differentiate between Islamism and Muslims.
Yes.
They're two very different things.
We have to make that distinction.
That's a problem.
Yes.
Political Islam is different from Salim Mansour or many others that I can think of.
Or you name it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's a very assertive philosophy, and we are not in an assertive time in the West. We've drawn in on ourselves, and we're trying to reassert ourselves. That's what the PPC is doing, is saying that we have value.
We think it's politically incorrect, though, to actually have and say out loud these values that we hold, right? And so that makes. I recently posted a video of one godless woman, right? She's telling a story. Here's a woman.
Her own experience.
There's a
Her
lot
own
of women like
experience,
her.
right?
Yeah.
And she was raped by someone from her community, and no one would help her. The police would not help her. And some of the comments that were on my line from people that I know, well, they're just mad at her because she's pointing out that the government has all basically bought into not being aware of what we're up against, and that these factions actually have power and control through money, through the UN, whatever it is. And so now our government is not listening to people's experience or to our concerns.
Well, because what happens is the Islamists, they use the religion
Right.
and they use their own people to promote and forward the agenda of supremacy. They're not necessarily following a Salim Mansour idea of Islam.
Right.
They're following their own version, and there's lots of arguments whether it's the traditional version, and then you get into the bit of the weeds because at some point somebody said that this is the perfect word from the perfect messenger, so how do you reform that? So there's a lot of nuance and a lot of distinction in this discussion that needs to happen, but at the end of the day, they're using this ideology of supremacy to forward the agenda, and they're using Muslims to do it through fear, through oppression, through violence. And because ultimately it's about power, it's about control.
Right.
And so that's where we're at. Now we have to be able to have the discussion
Right.
in Canada by our politicians who are representing Canadians in their best interest. If we don't have this discussion, we're giving it up.
Right.
We've already lost.
Yep.
Right? And they know that.
Yeah.
They know that. And so when a person like Salim Mansour wants to have that discussion and he's kicked out of the Conservative Party, or at least disqualified as a candidate,
And he was somebody that used to be very valued.
yes.
Yeah.
And so why are we there? Why are we at that point where we can't even have this discussion? Recognize what it is we need to recognize. Have the discussion, because part of the discussion is education and information.
Right.
So when I say I'm an anti-Islamist, I get right back in my face, I'm a bigot, I'm an Islamophobe, I'm, you name it, a racist, all these other taglines. But they don't even understand the difference between an Islamist and a Muslim. Now, the other side of the argument, of course, is that anybody who is Muslim is an Islamist. Well, that's obviously not true. And that,
Well, it's not
that
true.
is right. And that distinction needs to be made. The only way that distinction is going to be made and the information and education is going to come out is if we put it into the national discussion.
So a few things just to point. So this is not an area of expertise for me, right? So I'm coming at it from a layperson's view. So one of the things you're saying, and I want to tease this out, Mark, just to make sure I'm hearing what you're saying. So when you're talking about policy being created, you are more or less talking about what's going on with the bloc within the UN, and then they formulate policy, it comes down this way. When you talk about Islamists in Canada, this isn't necessarily, they don't have the political power at this point, but they have some social power that they're able to exert.
To, at some point, have that political power.
Potentially.
Right.
And you're recognizing that the Islamists, that's political Islam, right?
Yes.
Versus Muslims generally.
Right.
And just to put a really fine particular distinction on it. So the majority of people who die because of Islamists are Muslims, right?
Exactly.
And the majority of Muslims I know in Canada are rebelling against Islamists and their philosophy. And they've come here because they love the freedom
And
that
they
we
need
have.
to be supported, and they need representatives that will support that.
Exactly. So and so I have darling, wonderful friends in the Ahmadi community. So Ahmadi Muslims primarily are in Pakistan now, and they reject all kinds. They reject terrorism. They put the rule of law ahead of religious doctrine, and they are an incredibly persecuted minority, right?
Considered apostates.
Apostates, and so they come here, and so I'm always very careful to say the people who are here in our country, so many of them reject political Islam.
They left that oppression to come to Canada where it's free.
And I hear the frustration from them that we are not willing to have a conversation about political Islam because they're afraid that it will take root here. And so I don't know the statistics on how much infiltration has happened, right? I don't know. I haven't studied this. But I do know that there have been studies done in Europe. There's a guy, Ruud Koopmans, R-U-U-D Koopmans, who is a professor from Germany, who did a survey across Europe to see the attitudes. And there were factions within his survey, and it was all Muslim immigrants from the last, from Germany and all the major, England, France. And there was significant numbers who were saying things that I found to be very problematic. And they were things like that I do think that religious doctrine should become before the laws of the land.
Right.
And it was a majority, in particular, branches of the Islamic faith. So we can never paint them all with one brush. But we need to be able to have the conversations where we say, well, the data, the facts, the research, the empirical evidence actually says this community seems to have a problem with adapting to Western values.
Pew Research did a very similar and identified exactly the same thing.
And we should be able to have that conversation.
Yes, openly.
So that we're not betraying the Muslims who have come to Canada.
Yes.
This is
Well,
something that's really
they're an
important.
ignored minority.
Right.
They're not being represented very well at all.
And so what'll happen is if we don't have that discussion, then Muslims who just want to live their life, right? They have their faith. They want to live their life. They want to have their families, just like the rest of us do. They share the same values that we do. They want that, and they want to fight for that. But if we don't stand for them, they are more scared of political Islam than you or I or any of us put together. Because they understand what it'll do to them. That they've fled an area where it was being imposed on them and that oppression to come to Canada to escape that. We are doing an enormous disservice to our immigrants from those nations by not standing up and having this discussion.
Right. And it's not actually that hard because we're actually doing it right now. And amazingly, we're all from the PPC.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's
Well,
pretty
It's the only place you will have this discussion.
I mean, it just seems so crazy to me that after someone like Martin Luther King Jr. has said we've got to judge people by the content of their character, that we now have to reinforce the idea that your race doesn't matter, your religion doesn't matter. We
amazing.
really don't care. We only care about your character and your values.
Right.
It's
It's
baffling to me
astonishing.
that we have to do that.
Which is
again.
why Salim suggested we do this.
Right.
Because, I mean, he's an incredibly intelligent man who has a ton of experience, education, and brings the credibility. And he said, we need to do this roundtable. We need to show the Canadian public that we're not afraid to have this discussion. And we'll do it in a way, of course, because the PPC breeds intelligence, breeds critical thinkers, and we'll have this discussion, and we're not afraid to. And even if it didn't appear to happen, but even if there's agreements or disagreements, great, let's have those. Because if those disagreements are where we find truth. Ethan
can
spoke
have
of that earlier.
Yes, he did.
We need to have these debates if it turns into a debate.
Yeah.
And this is,
I think that's a good way to end.
I think so too.
Yeah, you've done a good job, all of you.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Thanks very much.